Before we start, I want you to understand something. Empires do not fall because of enemies. They fall because they ignore patterns. Rome didn't collapse from barbarian hordes. It collapsed from overstretch, corruption, and the mathematics of unsustainable expansion. Britain didn't lose its empire to rebellion alone. It lost it to debt, exhaustion, and the impossible cost of global policing. The Soviet Union didn't fall to America. It fell to itself, to rigidity, paranoia, and the death of belief. Every great power tells itself the same lie. We are different. We learned from their mistakes. But there is one country that doesn't just say this, it means it. China is the only modern superpower that treats imperial collapse like a science. Not as propaganda, not as mythology, but as a strategy. They study Rome's roads, Britain's banks, the Soviet Party's final quiet death. And they ask one question above all others. How do we make sure that never happens to us? This is the story of how China learned from every empire that failed, and whether those lessons will save them or doom them to repeat the same cycle. The Roman lesson: overstretch and decay. Yes, China learned from Rome, and this is how. You see, Rome's empire stretched from Scotland to Syria. Roads connected every frontier. Garrisons held every border. For centuries it worked. And then, slowly, quietly, it didn't. The problem wasn't the invasion. The problem was maintenance. Every road needed repair. Every garrison needed supplies. Every province needed an administration. The empire became a machine that consumed more than it produced. Tax bases shrank, the currency collapsed. Elite families hoarded wealth while the state starved. Rome fell not to barbarians, but to the cost of being Rome. Now consider this. China's Belt and Road Initiative spans 150 countries, ports in Pakistan, railways in Kenya, highways across Central Asia. It is the largest infrastructure project in human history. Some call it visionary. Others call it Roman. Critics argue that BRI resembles Rome's late empire, massive commitments to fragile client states, debt exposure, and reputational risk. If projects fail, if governments turn hostile, China inherits all the liabilities. The roads that connect an empire can also bleed it dry. But here's where it gets interesting. Chinese scholars know this. They study Roman overstretch explicitly. They model infrastructure investment against fiscal sustainability, and they have tools Rome didn't. China doesn't fund its empire through direct taxation and plunder. It uses loans, state-owned enterprises, multilateral mechanisms. If a project fails, debt can be restructured, lending can slow, commitments can shift. Rome had to hold every border. China can choose which borders to hold. The question is whether that flexibility is real, or whether modern finance is just a slower way to repeat Rome's mistakes. The British lesson: debt and global policing. At its peak, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's population. The sun never set on British territory. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. And then, in less than a generation, it was over. 2 world wars didn't just destroy infrastructure, they destroyed the financial foundation of the empire. Britain went from creditor to debtor, from hegemon to exhausted middle power. The lesson Chinese strategists took from this is specific. Global dominance has a cost. When you provide the reserve currency, you have to provide global liquidity. When you police the world, you pay for every conflict. When your banks become too big to fail, every crisis becomes your crisis. China studied Britain's financial overextension carefully, and they made a calculated decision. Don't rush to replace the dollar. Chinese policy writings warn against premature currency internationalization. They argue that making the renminbi a full reserve currency too quickly would force China into providing global public goods and capital freedoms that could destabilize the domestic economy. In other words, They watched Britain get crushed by the privilege of global financial leadership and decided the privilege wasn't worth it yet. But some Chinese voices disagree. They point out that America did inherit Britain's role successfully, that rising powers can reshape the system, that China could gradually move toward monetary prominence without repeating British mistakes. The debate continues. What's clear is this: China remembers what killed the British Empire, and they're betting that slow, patient accumulation beats sudden, glorious overreach. The Soviet lesson: ideological rigidity. The Soviet Union didn't fall to an invasion. It didn't fall to economic crisis alone. It fell because, in the end, nobody believed anymore. And Xi Jinping cannot stop talking about it. In internal speeches that later leaked to foreign analysts, Xi described the Soviet collapse in brutal terms. Their ideals and convictions wavered. In the end, all it took was one quiet word from Gorbachev, and a great party was gone. Nobody was a real man. Nobody came out to resist. This is not ancient history to Chinese leadership. This is a warning. Xi blames the Soviet collapse on what he calls historical nihilism, the idea that questioning the party's past undermines its legitimacy and cohesion. The lesson he drew was not reform the party. The lesson he drew was never let the party doubt itself. This explains the tightened internet controls, the purges of disloyal officials, the emphasis on ideology over pragmatism, the insistence that the People's Liberation Army is a party army, not a national one. Chinese strategists studied the Soviet collapse and concluded that glasnost, openness, was fatal, that political pluralism was fatal, that allowing the party to lose control of the military was fatal. So they built a system designed to prevent all three. Whether this prevents collapse or simply ensures collapse happens differently remains an open question. By the way, if you've made it this far into a documentary about Soviet ideological erosion and Chinese party discipline, you're probably the exact person this channel is for. So, subscribe? We promise more civilizational collapse analysis is coming. The Dynasty Mindset. But here's what makes China different from Rome, Britain, or the USSR. They've done this before. Chinese civilization has collapsed and rebuilt itself repeatedly. The Han fell, the Tang fell, the Ming fell, the Qing fell, and each time the empire reconsolidated under a new dynasty. Chinese historians call this the dynastic cycle: rise, consolidation, prosperity, corruption, crisis, collapse, and then reunification. The ruling philosophy was called the mandate of heaven. A dynasty ruled not by divine right, but by performance. If you maintained order, prosperity, and harmony, you kept the mandate. If you failed, if famines spread, if rebellions erupted, if the state decayed, heaven withdrew its favor, and someone else rose to claim it. This creates a distinct strategic psychology. Collapse is not unthinkable, it is expected. The Communist Party explicitly frames itself as the latest dynasty, not in those words, but in practice. They see themselves as guardians against chaos, protectors of unity, agents of civilizational continuity, and they have a modern version of loss of mandate, the century of humiliation. From 1839 to 1949, China was carved apart by foreign powers. Britain forced opium on them. Japan invaded. Western powers controlled Chinese ports and cities. In a 2021 speech, Xi Jinping said, "The Chinese people will absolutely not allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or enslave us. Anyone who tries will face an iron Great Wall forged by 1.4 billion people." This is not rhetoric. This is national memory used as political fuel. The message is clear. We collapsed before. We were humiliated before. We will never let it happen again. And so China applies Confucian ideas of hierarchy, legalist ideas of strict control, and dynastic ideas of cyclical survival, all filtered through the Marxist-Leninist party structure. It is an empire that thinks like a dynasty. The question: so, has China learned from every empire that failed? The optimistic answer: yes. They studied Rome and built flexible financing instead of fixed borders. They studied Britain and refused premature financial hegemony. They studied the Soviets and armored the party against ideological collapse. They remembered their own humiliation and made civilizational survival the core mission. China is the first empire in history to treat imperial failure as a field of study, to institutionalize the lessons, to plan for the long game. But the pessimistic answer: history doesn't care how much you study it. Critics argue China is repeating the same patterns. Belt and Road creates overstretch and backlash, just like Rome. Debt-fueled growth and property bubbles echo British financial strain. Ideological rigidity and surveillance echo Soviet brittleness. Centralization hollows out innovation. Control stifles adaptation. The greatest risk is this: China may have learned all the wrong lessons. They learned to fear openness, so they built walls. They learned to fear weakness, so they project strength. They learned to fear collapse, so they tightened control. But Rome, Britain, and the Soviets all fell because of rigidity. Because empires that cannot adapt eventually shatter. So the question is not whether China studied history, the question is whether they understood it. And if you want to keep exploring questions like this, how power is built, remembered, and defended across civilizations, this channel is going to keep digging. So subscribe, because the pattern isn't done yet. History does not repeat, it patterns. And the pattern is this: every empire believes it is different. Every empire studies the past. And every empire eventually discovers that knowing what went wrong is not the same as knowing how to stop it. China has done something unprecedented. They have turned imperial failure into a curriculum. But curriculums don't prevent collapse. Choices do. And we won't know if China made the right ones until the cycle completes. The greatest empires are not the ones that conquer the most. They are the ones who understand why others fell.